In 1968, on the coast of Ghana, a new factory opened in the port city of Tema. It carried a British name and a British trademark, the Crocodile, and it forged the same agricultural tools that Wolverhampton had once sold to the farmers of the empire. The making had begun to follow the market out of Britain. By then, the Crocodile Hoe had broken soil for 3 generations across West Africa, the Caribbean, and India. The Chillington Tool Company forged most of what it made for export. The tool was so common abroad that in half a dozen languages, the name of the brand had quietly become the ordinary word for a hoe. And there lay the paradox. A British tool, trusted by millions of farmers across 3 continents, was a near stranger on the ironmonger's shelf that forged it. But the real story of Chillington is not one factory or one crocodile stamped into steel. It is the story of black country iron sold to the whole world and what happened when the empire ended and the forging finally left Britain. The hoe crossed oceans. The works behind it could not cross the century unchanged. Every week we tell the stories of the tools, forges, and workshops that once shaped British industry, and what happened when the market moved on. Britain forged the steel. The trade proved the tool. The market changed the rules. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, the Chillington Iron Works in Wolverhampton in 1822. Wolverhampton, in 1822, was a town that ran on iron. Furnaces lit the night. Hammers set the rhythm of the working day. And on the site of an old manor house called Stowheath, 3 men, John Barker, James Foster, and George Jones, raised the first ironworks ever built inside the old boundary of the town. They named it after the ground it stood on. They called it the Chillington Iron Works. An ironworks in that age was not a tool company. It was a furnace and a rolling mill. It melted, puddled, and rolled raw iron into bar, plate, and rail for a nation laying railways and throwing bridges across its valleys. For half a century, that was the whole of the business, and for half a century, it paid. Then the ground shifted. In the 1870s, a long depression settled over British iron. Cheaper metal came onto the market, prices fell, and the Chillington Iron Company, built to roll iron for the railway age, found that the railway age no longer wished to pay for its iron. The works that had been raised to feed an industrial boom now ran, quietly and steadily, at a loss. A furnace cannot wait for a market to recover. It must earn, or it must close. So the directors made a decision that would change everything the name Chillington meant. On the 20th of April, 1876, the board minuted a proposal to take up the edge tool trade, to turn away from heavy iron and towards finished tools a worker would actually hold. An edge tool is a forged, hardened implement with a working edge, a hoe, an axe, a spade, shaped under a falling hammer rather than squeezed through a mill. It was a different craft, a different skill, and a different customer. By the 27th of July that same year, the record notes that the erection of a new edge tool and horseshoe works had already begun. The first thing the new works forged was not a hoe at all. It was a horseshoe. Under the brand King of the Road, Chillington became, by its own account, the largest maker of handmade horseshoes in the world. In the heat of a black country forge, a length of bar was drawn from the fire and struck to a curve, again and again, shoe after shoe, for a country that still moved on hooves. Behind each of those shoes stood a workforce that had watched the iron trade fail and been handed a second chance at the forge. The town needed the works. The works needed a product that would sell for the next 50 years, not the last 50. But the country was already changing beneath its feet. As the motorcar came, and the skilled smiths who could hand-forge a shoe grew fewer, the horseshoe trade began to slip. The works had a choice: cling to a fading product, or turn its forging capacity to something the world still needed in enormous numbers. It chose the hoe, and the world did need hoes, though not, at first, the world outside the window. Across the tropical territories of the British Empire, in West Africa, the Caribbean, and India, farming did not run on the plow. It ran on the hoe. On baked, sun-hardened, root-bound ground, a farmer broke the soil by hand, swinging a heavy blade down into the earth. Such ground destroyed a soft tool. It needed a blade that was properly forged and properly hardened, and across scattered colonies, no local smith could harden and replace such a tool reliably, at scale, year after year. Wolverhampton could. That was the gap Chillington stepped into. A British forge, thousands of miles from the fields, making the one tool those fields could not do without. In 1892, the operation was formalized as the Chillington Tool Company Limited, under a Wolverhampton man named John William Hunt. Here, one caution is worth marking because British tool history is full of names that echo. John William Hunt of Chillington was not the William Hunt of William Hunt and Sons, the Oldbury firm behind the braids. A different family, a different works, a different story this channel has already told. Two Hunts, two Black Country tool empires, no connection but the surname. Then, in 1901, Chillington registered the mark that would carry it around the world. Not a word. A picture. A crocodile. The reasoning was quietly brilliant. A farmer in the Gold Coast or Bengal might never read the English name stamped beside it, but he could recognize a crocodile. The brand became an image before it became a word, and that image would outlive almost everything else in this story. The company forged axes, forks, shovels, and spades besides, most of it for export. But it was the hoe, under the crocodile, that made the name. It traveled the way British goods traveled then, through export houses and colonial supply merchants, packed in crates that carried the crocodile stamped plainly on the wood, out through the docks, and onto plantation stores and village markets a Wolverhampton forgeman would never see. Records suggest the tool was known and trusted in those markets long before it was ever a household name at home, recognized first by the hands that used it, and only much later by the country that made it. How many it made at its height, the surviving record does not precisely say. The company claimed plainly to be the largest hoe maker in the world, and few in the trade troubled to argue. John William Hunt held the head of it until his death in 1925, at the age of 81. The man who had taken a failing ironworks and forged it into a tool empire. The founder was gone. But the crocodile was everywhere, and the tool that carried it was about to become something no British marketing plan could ever have designed, the ordinary word for a hoe, in languages Wolverhampton had never heard spoken. To understand what Chillington built, you have to put it in the hand. The crocodile hoe was not the light, long-handled scuffle hoe an English gardener pushes back and forth along a flower bed. It was a heavier thing entirely. A broad, flat blade of forged steel, wide as a spread hand, set into a socket the makers called the eye, an opening through which a stout hardwood handle was driven and wedged tight. The head sat at an angle to the shaft, and the tool was not pushed. It was swung, raised over the shoulder and brought down into the earth, again and again, chopping and dragging the soil open the way an adze opens timber. The shape itself was ancient. The hoe is one of the oldest tools on the planet, in much of the world, older than the plow. Chillington invented none of it. What Chillington did was take a form as old as farming and forge it to a standard, and at a scale that no village smith could match. That word, forge, is the whole of the difference. The Chillington head was drop-forged. A bar of steel, heated until it glowed, was hammered between heavy-shaped dies that struck it into form, so the very grain of the metal followed the shape of the blade. It was made from high-carbon steel with enough carbon in it to take a real hardness and hold an edge. And it was heat-treated, heated and quenched to set that hardness, then tempered back just enough that the blade was hard without being brittle. Now take that blade to the field. On sun-baked ground in West Africa or the Caribbean, matted through with roots, a thin blade merely stamped from sheet steel would flex, roll at its edge, or fold at the socket on the first serious strike. The forged Chillington blade bit into the root mat and held. It kept its edge through a full day's swinging and came back the next morning ready to do it again. That was the difference between a tool that lasted a season and a tool that lasted a working lifetime. The eye had a second virtue, quieter, but just as important. The handle was a consumable, the steel was not. When a shaft split or wore, a farmer knocked the old stick out of the eye, cut a fresh length of local hardwood, and drove it home into the same forged socket. One head could outlive a dozen handles. This was a tool built to be mended in the field, by the hand that used it, a small fact that will matter a great deal by the end of this story. A tool that good creates a problem for everyone trying to compete with it. And Chillington's advantage rested on three things a rival could not easily copy. The first was the Black Country itself, a district packed with forges, dies, hammers, and the skilled men who knew how to run them, concentrated within a few miles of Wolverhampton. The forging capacity that a single colonial workshop could never assemble sat, ready, in the West Midlands. The second was distribution. The tool reached the fields through a machinery built over generations, colonial agricultural supply, estate and plantation orders, and the great merchant houses at the docks that shipped British goods to every port the empire touched. At home, ironmongers and hardware wholesalers carried it on the shelf. Colonial agricultural departments, charged with raising yields across vast territories, wanted durable imported implements that would not fail in a farmer's hands. Estate managers standardized on tools they could reorder by a single trusted name. What a fine tool needs, above all, is to be buyable again. And the Crocodile was. The third moat was the strangest and the strongest. The brand became the tool. In market after market, a farmer did not walk in and ask for a hoe. He asked for it by a local name, the Azada, the Djembe, the Badza, the Mamuti, and behind those words, again and again, stood the same crocodile stamped into the same forged steel. When your brand name quietly becomes the ordinary noun for the thing itself, a competitor is no longer selling against a product. He is selling against language. The 1901 trademark protected exactly that. The crocodile was a picture the law would defend, and a farmer overseas could recognize on sight, whether or not he could read the English word beside it. What the first British purchase price was, in period pounds, the surviving record does not reliably tell us, but the value was never really in the price. It was in the promise. And that is the point to hold on to. The crocodile stamped into the steel was not a logo. It was a specification a farmer could not read, but could trust. By its own account, the company was the largest hoe maker in the world, and most of what it forged was carried out through the docks and away. Exact figures for those years are lost to an incomplete record, but the shape of the achievement is not in doubt. A single ancient tool, forged in one English town, feeding the fields of a hemisphere. Chillington had proved the tool. The next question was whether one Wolverhampton works could arm half the world with it, and it would not try to do that alone. By the middle of the 20th century, the crocodile had become one of the most widely used marks in the history of British tool-making. Not on a workbench in Birmingham, but in the soil of half a world. The Wolverhampton Works had grown to meet it. Through the 1920s, the buildings were extended and a new forging department raised, and by the years after the Second World War, the site was running hard. Bar heated, dies falling, hoe heads coming off the hammers in their thousands, day after day, for markets the men on the shop floor would never visit. The works had a fixed place in the town's geography as much as in its economy. Bar steel came in and finished tools went out along the canal that had served the site since the iron days, loaded from a basin that carried the company's own name, then on by rail and road to the docks. For well over a century, whatever else changed in Wolverhampton, the Chillington Works was simply there, a constant on the map, a name on the wages of families who had forged for it across 3 generations. And here the story of one company, and the story of a whole country line up almost exactly. After 1945, Britain was broke and desperate for trade. It had won a war and emptied its treasury doing it, and the watchword handed down from government to industry was blunt and everywhere: export or die. The nation needed to sell abroad to earn the foreign currency it could not otherwise find, and it needed firms that already knew how to do it. Chillington was such a firm. It had spent 60 years forging most of its output for export before the export drive was ever a slogan. What the country was now ordering every manufacturer to become, Wolverhampton already was. So Chillington did not merely survive the post-war years, it sat at the center of them. And around 1953, it sat at the center of something larger still. By that year, Chillington had been drawn together with the other great edge tool makers of the district into a single industrial combine, the group that would come to be known as EVA Industries. It gathered names that between them held generations of black country forging: Edward Elwell of Wednesbury, A.W. Wills and Son of Wolverhampton, John Yates and Company, also of Wolverhampton, and the Phoenix Shovel Company of Cradley Heath. Hoes, axes, forks, shovels, spades. Between them, by their own account, they formed the largest group of edge tool makers in the world, and, like Chillington, they sent most of what they made out through the docks. This was the Black Country doing the one thing it had always done best. Not one great factory, but a dense cluster of specialized firms, each a master of its own forged shape, packed into a few square miles of the West Midlands. It was a concentration of skill no rival nation could easily assemble, and no colonial workshop could hope to match. And skill of this kind did not come from a manual. A forgeman learned, over years at the hammer, to read a glowing bar by its color, to place a blow, to know when the steel was ready to take its shape and when it would tear. That knowledge lived in hands, not books, and it passed at the forge from one man to the next. It could be built across generations. It could not be bought in an afternoon, a fact that would matter enormously the day the making moved somewhere else. But the true measure of Chillington's peak was not the size of the group. It was where the tool ended up, and how long it stayed there. The crocodile hoe became the standard implement of smallholder farming across an enormous stretch of the earth: West Africa, the Caribbean, the Indian subcontinent, and the fields of Southeast Asia. It was the tool a farmer inherited from his father and expected to pass to his son. And then something happened that almost no British export brand ever achieves. It outlived the empire that carried it. When the Gold Coast became independent Ghana in 1957, when Nigeria raised its own flag in 1960, when colony after colony became a nation in its own right, the political world that had first shipped the crocodile abroad dissolved. The flags changed, the governments changed, The maps were redrawn. And the hoe did not change at all. The tool built for colonial agriculture simply carried on as the tool of independent farmers, wanted now not because an empire supplied it, but because it worked. From the yam and cassava plots of West Africa to the cane fields of the Caribbean, from the tea gardens of the subcontinent to the paddy margins of Southeast Asia, the same forged blade turned the same soil. In countless households, it was the most valuable steel tool a family owned, mended, rehandled, and kept for decades, handed down like an heirloom because a good one simply did not wear out. Very few British goods made that crossing. The Crocodile made it without breaking stride. Hold for a moment on what that tool meant to the hand that held it. Across much of the tropics, the ground must be broken, and the crop planted in the short window before the rains arrive, and a farmer works against the calendar itself. On that hard, root-bound earth, a soft or badly hardened blade doubles the labor of every stroke and stretches a day's clearing into two, and in that stolen time, a planting season can be lost. A forged Chillington edge, biting clean and holding true, could be the difference between a field opened before the rains and a family that went short for a year. This was never only a tool. On the right morning, it was food. Back in Wolverhampton, that demand took a physical shape you could stand inside. In the packing warehouse, forged hoe heads rose in stacks, dull gray and identical, waiting for their handles and their crates. Each carried the same small stamp, the crocodile, catching the light the same way on the 1,000th head as on the first. Boxed and labeled, they went out through the worksgate towards the docks and out across the sea to fields whose names most of the men who forged them could not have found on a map. For the new nations themselves, that reliability carried a value beyond the harvest. A government building its first agricultural programs needed a tool its people already owned, already understood, and already trusted enough to stake a season on. And the crocodile was waiting, unchanged, on the store shelf. A brand can earn no higher recognition than to become the thing a country reaches for when it has to feed itself. The group was confident enough, by the 1950s, to reach beyond edge tools altogether. A jig and tool division was formed, jigs and tools being the precise fixtures and cutting tools that guide the making of other machines, and Chillington's forging skill was turned to work for the aircraft, motor, and domestic appliance industries. A firm that had begun by rolling iron for railways and made its name on a farmer's hoe was now shaping fixtures for aeroplanes. The reach ran wider than a single mark, too. Across the group, hoes and forks went out under a whole family of brand names for different markets and merchants. The Crocodile, the most famous of them, but far from the only one. A buyer might not know he was holding a Chillington tool at all. He knew only that it was the one his father had sworn by. How large did it all become? By its own steady claim, the largest hoe maker in the world, most of it exported. The precise annual figures now lost to an incomplete record. But the scale is not really in doubt. One ancient tool, one English town, and the fields of a hemisphere. The works had never been busier, and the decision that would slowly empty it was about to arrive dressed up as expansion. The end of the British story does not begin with a fire, a bankruptcy, or a padlocked gate. It begins with something that looked, at the time, exactly like success. In 1964, in the Nigerian port city of Port Harcourt, a new factory opened under the Crocodile mark. In 1968, another rose at Tema, on the coast of Ghana. They were built to make matchets, the tool trade's old spelling of machete, the long, broad cutting blade a farmer uses to clear brush and cut cane, the close sibling of the hoe in the very same tropical fields. Same mark, same forged steel, same agricultural trade. Only the address had changed. For the group, the logic was sound and even admirable. Making tools close to the people who used them cut the cost of freight, sidestepped the tariffs that independent nations were beginning to raise against imported goods, and answered a new political mood. Newly free countries increasingly wanted the things they used made within their own borders, by their own workers, not shipped in from the old imperial center. It was good business. It was, arguably, the right business. It was also, seen from Wolverhampton, the first crack in the wall, because every blade forged in Tama was a blade not forged in the West Midlands. Every order filled in Port Harcourt was an order that no longer crossed the sea from a black country works. Slowly, without a single dramatic day, the center of gravity of the whole Crocodile enterprise had begun to move, away from the town that had built it and towards the fields that had always used it. Beneath that single decision ran a far larger current, and it is the force that shaped this entire chapter. The end of empire did not merely change flags and governments, it changed who made things. Independence was not only political, it was industrial. A new nation that had spent its colonial life as a supplier of raw materials and a buyer of finished British goods did not wish to stay that way. It built its own factories and its own tool trades as a matter of national pride and a hard economic necessity both. And so the vast, captive export market that had made Chillington the largest hoe maker in the world began, decade by decade, to learn how to supply itself. This is the quiet tragedy beneath the loud one. A company can be undone not because it failed, but because it succeeded so completely that it taught the whole world to do what it did. The market Chillington had spent a century serving was, in the end, growing up. And a market that grows up no longer needs the parent that fed it. Then came a second pressure, harder and colder than the first. As those markets opened, they filled not only with locally made tools, but with cheap imports from the world's lowest-cost producers, mass-produced hoes and matchets, stamped and finished for a fraction of the forged British price. And here is the hard truth of every market this channel has ever examined. A farmer standing in a village market with little money in his hand buys the tool he can afford today, not the one that would still be good in 20 years. The cheap blade did not have to be better than the Crocodile. It did not even have to be good. It only had to be cheap enough, and just good enough, for the buyer in the aisle. Against that arithmetic, a premium British tool, forged in the West Midlands and shipped halfway around the earth, had no answer at all. And unlike the other British tool empires this channel has buried, Chillington had almost no home market to fall back on. It had always been an export company. The Crocodile had never been a household name on a British high street. So when these same years brought the collapse of the old British retail trade, as the independent ironmongers and hardware shops that once knew a good forged tool were swept aside, through the 1970s and 1980s, by the rise of the DIY chains and their price-driven shelves, there was no domestic cushion waiting to catch the firm. The new sheds sold light, cheap garden hose to weekend gardeners who neither knew the Crocodile nor needed it. A company that had lived by export had nowhere to retreat to when export grew hard. Back at the works, no forgeman would have named a single morning as the turning point. What he saw instead was subtler, and in its way, worse. He saw order books that no longer grew, and then began to shrink. He saw export lines that thinned. He saw a works still busy, still forging, still paying wages, but no longer expanding, no longer certain, no longer the center of a world that had once turned around the stamp it put on steel. While the market shifted beneath the works, The corporate world above it kept rearranging. The EVA industries combine that had gathered the Black Country's great edge tool makers into one body did not endure as an independent power. And in 1998, the matter was settled for good. The Chillington Tool Company, the firm founded in Wolverhampton in 1892, the largest hoe maker in the world by its own long-held claim, was acquired by Ralph Martindale and Company, the Birmingham house established in 1874. After more than a century as a name in its own right, Chillington became a wholly owned subsidiary of another firm. Read that carefully, because it is the whole of the story's central force in a single line. The name survived. The independence did not. Chillington was no longer a great works steering its own course. It had become a brand, a valuable, trusted, world-famous brand, held inside a larger group. The Crocodile remained. The empire behind it did not. And there is a darker proof of just how far the mark had drifted from the forge. The Crocodile had become so valuable, so trusted, so instantly recognized across so much of the world that it became worth faking. Across the very markets the brand had spent a century building, counterfeiters began copying the mark and the label, stamping crocodiles onto inferior blades and passing them off as the real thing. And so the company that had once guaranteed its steel with a Black Country forge and a forgeman's skill was reduced to guaranteeing it another way, with authenticity stickers, printed guides, and warnings to farmers on how to tell a genuine crocodile from a fraud. Sit with what that means. The stamp had once been the specification itself, the one thing that could not be faked, because the forging and the hardening behind it could not be faked. Now the stamp could simply be copied onto any blade, and the promise had to be defended with a label on the packaging. When a brand is forced to teach its own customers how to spot a forgery of itself, the distance between the name and the making has become the entire story. And it is the most vulnerable buyers who pay for it. The Crocodile had been designed, from the very beginning, for the farmer who could not read the English name, who trusted the picture because the picture had never once lied to him. A counterfeit crocodile attacks exactly that trust and exactly that person, the smallholder with no way to know that the blade in his hand will fold on the first hard root. The forgery does not merely steal a sale, it spends down a century of earned faith, one disappointed farmer at a time. Underneath all of it ran the oldest force this channel knows. A hoe is a low-margin tool. It sells for little and lasts for years. A wonderful thing for a farmer, a hard thing for a manufacturer. Forging that tool in the high-cost West Midlands, from British steel, with British wages and British energy, and then shipping it to markets that could now make or import their own, was an arithmetic that worsened with every passing decade. The tool could still be superb. Blade for blade, it could still be the best in the world, and it could still be too expensive to keep forging in the place that had always forged it. So the British operation contracted the way so many British tool firms contracted, not in one collapse, but in a long, quiet retreat. The great Wolverhampton works, with its extended buildings, its forging departments, and the canal basin that carried the company's own name, wound down over years the record does not cleanly date. What survived of Chillington's British tool-making drew back into a smaller operation at Willenhall, at an address that folded the old identity into its very name. Crocodile House, Strawberry Lane. From a works that had claimed to arm a hemisphere to a division at a single address. What became of the rest is the part the record tells most quietly. The extended sheds, the forging departments, the great hammers, wound down, cleared, repurposed, or scrapped over years no tidy date will fix. And with them went something that could not be cratted and shipped. The men. The forgemen who could read a glowing bar by its color and place a blow by instinct, did not hand that knowledge to a new generation at a Wolverhampton hammer. Because there was no longer a Wolverhampton hammer for a new generation to stand at. The skill that had taken generations to build and could not be bought in an afternoon simply dispersed into retirement, into other trades, into memory. A works can be rebuilt. A tradition of hands, once broken, is far harder to forge again, and the making itself scattered across the map. Today, the group forges its crocodile tools not in one English town, but across England, Ghana, and Thailand, and the largest maker of crocodile agricultural tools in the world now stands at Tema, in Ghana, not in Wolverhampton at all. The crocodile blade a buyer lifts today may be rolled from British steel and then forged thousands of miles away. The center of the empire had moved out to its edges, nor did moving production abroad guarantee anything. In Nigeria, the Port Harcourt plant that had opened with such promise in 1964 spent its later decades fighting conditions no forge on earth can beat, and in 2009, unable to run competitively against unreliable power and failing utilities, local manufacturing there was suspended. Even the tool made where it was used could be beaten by the ground beneath the factory floor, and so the arc closes, the way these arcs close. The empire ended. The markets grew their own. The cheap blade won the aisle. The export lines thinned. The combine dissolved. The name was bought. The great works wound down. The skill dispersed. The forging left Wolverhampton. The crocodile stayed on the steel. The industrial world behind it did not. The mark survived. The only question left is what it still means. The crocodile did not die. In one sense, it is larger now than it has ever been. Under Ralph Martindale, the Crocodile brand is, by the group's own account, sold across some 140 countries and registered in dozens more, a mark more widely spread across the world map today than at any point in its long history. And a thread of it remains stubbornly British. At Willenhall, the Chillington name still forges hoes and forks in England, from high-carbon steel in the old hot-forged way. The name lived. But the shape of the thing inverted. The brand went global. The British making shrank to a fraction of what it once was. A world-famous crocodile and a very small English works behind the part of it that stayed. And then, quietly, something unexpected began to happen at home. In Britain, the tool is being rediscovered, not by farmers, but by gardeners, allotment holders, no-dig and permaculture growers, and smallholders have found that the old Chillington hoe, the azada, cuts through bramble root and matted couch grass in a way that a light stamped garden hoe never will. They buy them new from a handful of specialist sellers, and they hunt the old forged heads wherever they surface, at car boot sales, on auction sites, in the backs of sheds cleared after a death. Second-hand crocodiles now pass from hand to hand among British gardeners who have stumbled, a century late, onto what tropical farmers knew all along. A new forged head costs only a few tens of pounds, nothing beside a power tool, and a bargain against something that will likely outlast the person who buys it. The old heads change hands for less still, sometimes for little more than the price of a pint, passing from people who do not know what they are holding to people who do. On gardening forums and in restoration videos, the azada has become a quiet cult object, living proof that a genuinely good tool needs no advertising but its own edge. Here is the test that separates memory from use. Take a cheap pressed steel garden hoe to a root, and it skates over the top. Take a properly forged, hardened Chillington hoe to the same root, and it cuts through. That is not nostalgia. It is metallurgy. And because the eye was built to be rehandled, a good head fitted with its third or fourth fresh handle is still opening ground in an English garden today. The tool was made to be mended and kept, not thrown away and replaced. And the ones that were kept are, quite simply, still working. And the place where all of it began? On the site of the old Stowheath Manor, where the first ironworks inside Wolverhampton's boundary lit its furnaces in 1822, there is now an industrial estate, units and roads, and the ordinary quiet of a modern working district. The canal that once carried the company's own name, and its crates towards the docks, still runs its old course through the town. You could stand on that ground today and find almost nothing to tell you that from here, for a century and a half, one English town helped arm the fields of half the world. There is one last thread, and it ties this story to another. When Chillington was drawn into that great edge tool combine in 1953, one of the names beside it was Edward Elwell of Wednesbury. The axe maker this channel has already followed to its own ending. 2 black country firms, one group, the same forging world, 2 different endings. The district that made them is full of such ghosts. So what does Chillington finally leave us? Perhaps this. Britain's most widely used hand tool was one that Britain itself barely noticed. A tool it forged for other people's fields and never quite claimed as its own. It outlived the empire that carried it and the competitors that undercut it. But it survived only by letting the making leave the country that gave it its name. The crocodile endures. The forge that first stamped it does not. And that gap, between a name half the world still trusts and a works that no longer stands, is the truest measure of both what was built here and what was let go. It is a very British ending. A country that said it prized durability, repair, and a familiar name found, when it counted, that its markets rewarded something else entirely. Price, speed, and the convenience of buying the same thing twice. Chillington did not lose because its tool was poor. It lost the works because the tool was too good to stay profitable in the place that made it best. Somewhere in an allotment shed in England tonight, an old Chillington hoe leans in a corner, its handle the third or fourth that some hand has fitted to it, the crocodile still just legible on the worn steel, waiting for the ground to soften, and one more season's work. The making left, the name stayed, the steel still cuts. See you in the next one.